Good morning to everyone, and I would like to welcome you to the side event on integrated strategy for effective governance of global crime, UNTOC, UNCAC, rule of law and sustainable development goals. It is a panel or side event that is jointly organized by European Public Law Organization, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and the International Center for Criminal Law Reform. We have here an excellent panel of experts, and I would like to also say that three of them at least are joining us at 3 o'clock in the morning from Canada. So to them a special good morning 3 times. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So I am Ugis Vekic. I am ambassador of the European Public Law Organization here at the UN in Vienna, and at the same time senior advisor at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and I will be your main moderator. So I can start with a few introductory words about the topic. That one we can, that's the title. So we have witnessed not only now, but over time, changes in the organized crime paradigm. For a long time, the main, I would say, variable of organized crime was violence. It is still today very much, but more often than not, organized crime groups are using corruption as an instrument to place illicit gains, particularly in the legal economy, as well as to overcome a number of hurdles posed by law enforcement, justice system, etc., etc. So corruption is starting to play much more important role in the organized crime paradigm than it used to have in the past, including when United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime was thought of, developed, and adopted, and came into vigor. The same thing or different same changes have happened with the corruption paradigm, which for a long time was looked at the individual level as an individual transaction between two bad individuals, to move to what we are calling organized corruption, and that is becoming more and more a collective, well-planned transaction involving both organized crime groups, but also very legal entities, including political parties, for example, business environment, again, for the same purpose as the organized crime existence, and that is making profit in an illicit way. What we have actually is, and I have here in brackets, transnational grand organized corruption. That organized corruption is not only a national phenomenon, it is regional, and it is very much international. And what Transparency International, and I think Gillian Dell will talk about that more, calls grand corruption, is across borders, exemplifies this transnational organized corruption. And that is one of the changes that we have noted in the corruption as well as in the organized crime paradigm, both as the phenomena at the phenomenological basis, but as well on the response platform that is within the legislation, including UNTOC and UNCAC. What we have actually as international normative and policy platforms are the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And then on the other hand side, we have developmental and political platform represented by Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, in particular, goal number 16 and targets 16.4, 16.5, and 16.6, which talk about organized crime and how to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms, and respectively to strengthen institutions. So this is a normative platform, legislative, political, and developmental, that we have today at the international level to deal with organized crime and corruption, including these new transformations of the paradigms that I have been, that I talked about. There are a number of common features between UNTOC and UNCAC, including universality of ratification, criminalization, for example, money laundering, corruption, obstruction of justice are three criminal offense categories common to both UNTOC and UNCAC. Both of them have prevention. Both of them insist very much, because they are international treaties on international cooperation, mutual legal assistance, international asset recovery. They have very similar governance arrangements, COP and COSP, this is the Conference of State Parties for both of them. And they have very similar review mechanisms, though at a different dynamics in their implementation. What we have today is what I call trans-conventions crimes. And there is a growth in these trans-conventions illicit threats and challenges. This is actually linkages between organized crime, politics, and business on high international, regional, and international level. These linkage between transnational organized crime and transnational organized grand corruption is what I call trans-conventions crimes, because they come across both UNTOC and UNCAC and sustainable development goals. And what I'm afraid of is that we don't have actually good machinery developed to deal with these emerging threats and challenges. So what we really need is a strategic, integrated global crime governance, and that is transnational organized crime, corruption, and technological information challenges. This is the newly start of cybercrime convention, but they do request an integrated and strategic international crime governance response, which we unfortunately do not have. So these are some of the things that I feel we can, in this very, very short time period, address a little bit. So I would now like, and I go as we go on, to present our contributors. First, I really have a pleasure to present Jessica John. She is Senior Associate from the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice Policy in Vancouver. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you to everyone for being here today. Just sharing my screen. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, thank you. We are at this side event today at a time of escalating conflict, shifting geopolitical priorities, and intensifying cyber vulnerabilities. International cooperation is more important than ever and remains an indispensable part of any future anti-crime strategy, especially against transnational organized crime and corruption. Cooperation can unfold between or among states, as well as other stakeholders like civil society and the private sector, which will continue to be crucial partners as the ad hoc committee negotiates the elaboration of the new cybercrime treaty. As we continue to witness the deterioration of cooperation, we must reflect on some of the reasons why the cooperation regime is not living up to its full promise, and look ahead to how we might adapt our approach and what reforms we might implement to improve the cooperation regime and states' relations. At present, the global cooperation regime is disjointed, complex, and the legacy tools on which cooperation relies are unable to keep pace with the rate of technological developments and the evolving patterns in transnational organized crime. What is perhaps even more pressing, however, is the geopolitical landscape within which states must cooperate. Where states' national interests converge and where there is a need to face a common threat, two essential components of international cooperation are trust and reciprocity. The extension of trust from one state to another, or from one law enforcement agency to another, is what makes cooperation possible. Experts have observed that today's globalized world is more dependent on trust today than ever before. Yet in the current geopolitical context and in our increasingly polarized world, there is a major trust deficit in international relations, and indeed the reality of international relations permeates discussions of international criminal justice cooperation. Consequently, formal cooperation avenues are increasingly replaced by informal and unilateral measures, which sometimes operate in the absence of independent oversight or beyond the law. In our chapter for Slawomir Rito's edited book, The Rule of Law in Retreat, Professor Dandrand and I argued that international cooperation in criminal matters will increasingly manifest in issue-specific coalitions or cooperation bubbles among like-minded states, leading something like a club-based international system. Some of those clubs or alliances will be less viable than others, and there will be space for organized crime and corruption to continue to operate and prosper. Looking ahead to the future of international cooperation, we might question what is worth saving from the current cooperation system and what are its crucial missing elements. We might also wonder what it would take for states to invest or to reinvest in more effective multilateral mechanisms for international criminal justice cooperation, and what function should the UN and other international organizations, as well as civil society, perform to meaningfully advance the discussion towards more imaginative and innovative tools to facilitate cooperation. As the world continues to confront turbulence and polarization, with uncertain trends unfolding in an arguably volatile environment, we would be remiss to expect that international cooperation will emerge spontaneously or by relying on the existing systems. Thank you, and I will now turn it to Professor Dandrand.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Guy. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Jessica referred to the limitations of legacy cooperation tools and the fact that we could have tried to discuss some of them today, but our focus has been not so much on the technical aspect of the question, but on the changing geopolitical landscape that makes international cooperation more complex and more precarious than ever. We're essentially witnessing a reshaping of the global political order, and as some of our panelists today have suggested, a withdrawal from the rule of law. As Jessica also mentioned, some of the main fault lines in the current international criminal justice cooperation regime have not only been obvious for a long time, but they seem to be widening. That governance that Ugi mentioned earlier is still a long time from emerging. One scenario for the future international cooperation is that states could reimagine and adapt the existing cooperation mechanism to fit the demands of our time. But we don't see that happening. And hopefully some of the discussions that are taking place this week at the Commission, but also in other fora, might trigger an awareness of the urgency to deal with some of those issues. There are potential scenarios for greater, better governance of international cooperation. For example, extradition expert David Sadoff proposed that states could establish an international arbitration process to which unilateral actions or cooperation non-compliance by states could perhaps be resolved. With the growing menace of transnational organized crime, the stakes are too high, and we just cannot simply sit back and hope for the best. Some fundamental changes are necessary, and we hope that discussions like this one today and other initiatives by the global initiatives and its partners can lead in that direction. Now, let's go back for a second, if you would allow me, to some of the basic principles. Jessica and I have been trying to go back to, well, what makes international cooperation possible, and the basic ingredients, in addition to converging national interests, as she said, are the two essential ingredients are trust and reciprocity. Extension of trust from one state to another, or from one law enforcement agency to another, is what makes cooperation fighting organized crime possible. Reciprocity is what makes it sustainable. People say today that today's globalized people say that in today's globalized world, we're all more dependent than ever on trust. However, trust, as we can all see at the international level, in international relations, is very short supply these days. There is a major deficit in international relations, deficit of trust. And let's face it, the nasty reality of international relations permeates discussions of international cooperation in criminal matters. Cybersecurity, in particular, is especially revealing of the state's unwillingness to sacrifice sovereignty in favor of effective criminal justice cooperation. I think that the negotiations of the proposed new convention against cybercrime will obviously be a test of that resolve. It certainly seem at this point that the resolve is on the weak side. So I like to quote sometimes Stuart Patrick and others who've argued that weak international cooperation is a choice, not an inevitability. So I hope that they're right, and I hope that the right choices will be made in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, very much for your presentation. I didn't have a chance to present you properly, but I think most of the people know you. Yvonne is a professor emeritus, fellow of the Vancouver Center, an all-timer in the international cooperation and linked with the UN work. I have now a pleasure to call Professor Slavomir Redo, professor at the United Nations Law University. He was the former UN crime prevention, criminal justice expert, staff of the UNODC. He's the author of the seminal book, I must say, of the Blue Criminology, which talked about UN criminology, and he's the editor of the most recent book that just came out on the rule of law. So, Slavomir, the floor is yours. Put the mic on, please.
Slavomir, you're still muted.
You are muted.
Yes, Ambassador, sorry for this hiccup. Thank you again for the invitation and for me joining you in this distinguished group of panelists and audience. I have a very short presentation that really involves something that starts with the book that in fact to which Yvonne, Jessica, and Megan also contributed, The Rule of Law in Retreat. And the title, Challenges to Justice in the United Nations World, I would have now changed to the United Nations Sustainable World. But be that as it may, you in your flyer, in your invitation, proposed two questions concerning this, to which I will try to answer. I will not read them. You can read them. In the interest of time, I will only pass to replies, and I will try to answer these two questions in a somewhat provocative way. Yes, indeed, UNTOC and UNCAC and the SDGs have their own governance bodies. Moreover, legally speaking, the first two instruments are treaty instruments. So the 2030 agenda is a soft law instrument, so as if it was sort of hierarchically below the treaty instrument. But, you know, in a sense, there is a paradox because at least in my look at the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, it's above all other United Nations treaty instruments, save the United Nations Charter, because of sustainable development issues. And I also noted that in your flyer, you referred to SDG 4 and 5. I will speak on behalf of SDG 3, that deals really with promotion of the rule of law, which I really think that it tops the question of that we are discussing right now. Why I am doing so, and why I am still a bit more provocative in what I'm saying. We know that peace and security and that there is no peace without justice, these are just canonical precepts of the UN. And we also know that justice is not an international public law concept. It's not at all. Justice as such is a natural law concept, hence the SDG 16 speaks only about the access to justice to be provided by international public law. So in other words, it is not the SDG 16, but out there in heaven for theists, in other heaven for the atheists like Confucians, or in nature as interpreted by the UN Secretary General in his annual reports to the GA, which are entitled exactly Harmony with Nature. Moreover, if you want to take a look at one of the recent United Nations General Assembly Resolution 73/235 on harmony with nature, nature is written with capital N, not with a lowercase n, but with capital N, with Mother Earth, of course, in capital letters. It means that for the UN, because of this resolution that we have now in front of us, nature or Mother Earth has legal personhood. It has legal personhood. It is simply not the object of law, but the subject of law, of United Nations law. So I really like Yvonne's concept of trust and reciprocity as far as international relations are concerned. But I would like to extend this concept of trust and reciprocity meant as mutuality or win-win in, I would say, 1990 United Nations terms, to something that is now in the United Nations called a triple win. A triple win. This is a slide, a photo, a figure taken from UNDP Sustainable Development Report from 2012 that speaks of triple wins that are located just in this area. I mind you again that this is a 2012 report. Now, what really comes to me when I see this 2012 report is that we are not addressing in that report Mother Nature or Mother Earth or nature as a subject of law with its own personhood. And just a few days ago, I got hold of this report by the UNODC on toolkit on stakeholder engagement in the implementation of the UNODC. And I would like to give you 3 examples where this triple win with Mother Earth, with nature may come into play by writing such a letter on behalf of civil society, of CSO, or of NGO. The sample of this letter you see in this technical assistance manual. First is to implement the agenda solidarity principle, leaving no one behind. So those who benefit least, for instance, of women, deserve help from those who benefit most. It sounds very general, of course, but in other words, by controlling through implementation of the two conventions, the reduction of excessive economic inequality, for example, through assisting in arriving at better returns on asset recovery, so the least advantaged, for example, trafficked women and children, or smuggled environmental migrants, rather stay home and are better off there than go abroad. And a CSO can do this, alerting the focal governmental point that the assets recovery may be also a recovery for better life of would-be migrants and trafficked women and children. Second, the civil society may help extend civil rights and duties to new local groups, that is through networking. And this means really, for example, that when assisting a recipient country in modernizing its property rights that may enable sustainable livelihood and the restoration protection of a country's natural habitat. This is also for Mother Earth, for nature. And last, finally, since the lack of accountability hampers any serious efforts in international environmental governance, in my opinion, the civil society may help to advocate introducing into legal reforms checks and balances that may enable accountability and transparency of legal arrangements in environmental justice projects. For example, by monitoring of and altering to the alleged fraud and corruption in such environmental justice projects. So I would use this simple letter, just focusing more precisely on what we want concerning the implementation of the two conventions, including the environmental justice issue, which seems to me a common denominator between the governments and the people at large amid climate change challenges and of course amid migration. So that's with this, I thank you very much for your invitation and I'm very happy to be here and listen to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Redo, for this very interesting and thought-provoking statement. It is a great pleasure of mine to call Mr. Jan Tennant, who is the head of the Vienna Multilateral Representation at the UN, and also the director of the Resilience Fund at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share my slides now, and I will very briefly go through some of the research and analysis and engagement that we at the Global Initiative have done on the links between organized crime and corruption and how better to respond in a more integrated way, as the other panelists have been discussing also. So I want to talk in a bit of detail about a process we went through at the Global Initiative last year, where we convened a leading group of our network of experts to discuss these issues. This is actually in the context of the Italian G20 presidency, where they were looking at the issues of the links between organized crime and corruption. We interviewed several of those experts and produced a report which outlines an understanding of the links between organized crime and corruption, what we call organized corruption, as Ugi mentioned earlier. We analysed the scale of the threat that those links present, and we assessed the adequacy of the current range of multilateral responses to respond to them, as well as making some recommendations. And just very briefly, say there are definitional challenges that we have to go through in order to discuss these issues. There are two widely ratified UN conventions, but a lack of clarity over specific terminology. And because of that, and because of the two separate conventions, the two phenomena broadly included in these conventions tend to be addressed separately, whether through the UN processes or including in research and academia as well. So we like to use the term organized corruption as Ugi described earlier, as the manifestation of those links. And key to understanding these links between organized crime and corruption are the links between crime, business, and politics. And since the publication of the report I was referring to at the beginning, the Global Initiative published the Organized Crime Index, the Global Organized Crime Index, at the end of last year, which has once again highlighted the predominance of state actors as vectors and facilitators of organized criminal markets. And you can see on the slide some of the findings. I recommend you go and look at the website if you haven't done so already, but the key finding relevant to this debate is that state actors are the most dominant agents in facilitating illicit economies and inhibiting resilience to organized crime. And then, you know, practically at the local level, this is a quote that I received from an NGO that we interviewed in Guinea-Bissau, which gives you a kind of manifestation of what this looks like at the local level. Drug traffickers support politicians on the understanding that if they win, they will leave the traffickers alone, and politicians also need a way to launder their money, so links with organized crime are useful. So all of these different phenomena, whether in the private sector, public sector corruption, local level crime, crime at the high level of the states, they all exist on a spectrum, is what we found during this research. And all of these manifestations influence and interact with each other, and we visualized it in this triangle with organized corruption as the kind of heart of the problem, and those different manifestations, whether it's criminal governance at the local level, where organized crime groups have a violent hold over local communities, state capture at the high level, corporate crime in the private sector. And when we look at the multilateral responses that we don't have a deficit in multilateral instruments. In fact, we have a plethora of different multilateral instruments that we can use, whether it's the UNTOC and the UNCAC, but also the other regional mechanisms that exist, the Financial Action Task Force, the OECD Bribery Convention. But what we see is that all of these different instruments, which are manifested on this slide by the different arrows, are aimed at different manifestations of organized corruption. There's nothing overarching, which is taking aim at the heart of the problem. And we can also see that the nature of organized corruption itself acts as a protective force field. So when we're targeting those different crimes, you can the power of those state actors that are facilitating criminal markets or those linked to them can stop those instruments being implemented effectively, and can stem the international cooperation that needs to be done, as Yvonne and Jessica were describing earlier. So this kind of sums up through the research that we did. This was John Gatunga, who's a renowned anti-corruption expert, member of our network. He sums it up as this being the problem. There's been an assumption that if you pass a law, create an institution, implement the UNTOC, the UNCAC, for example, then you solve the problem. But actually the normative situation has not been changed when the same bunch of crooks can work around what they see as bumps in the road. So following this report, we worked with Transparency International to try and take this further with Gillian, and we submitted a paper to the UNCAC Conference of Parties in December, which had some examples of the links between organized crime and corruption, and pointing out that there is a lack of coordination between the two conferences of parties, between those conferences of parties and the other policy bodies in Vienna, including the CCPCJ, where we are today, and not least with the rest of the UN system. So we made a number of recommendations. Introduction of regular joint meetings of the UNTOC and UNCAC conferences, their working groups, their review mechanisms, the use of the CCPCJ as a forum for some of these joint discussions, which include other multilateral bodies and civil society, which are registered for all of those bodies, because we believe civil society can be a bridge between them. Reporting back from these collaborative meetings to those overarching conferences. And lastly, and very importantly, at the moment, enhanced access for civil society to all COSP and COP subsidiary bodies to improve transparency and build those bridges between the different mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, very much for this very systematic presentation. Also, what the global initiative and including the Transparency International field should be done in the future on a policy level, including the role of the civil society. It is my pleasure to present now Megan Kapp. She is the doctorate student at the UN University of Peace in Canada. And as we heard, she already published an important piece of her work in a book on rule of law in retreat that Slavomir Redo edited. So Megan, it is your turn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, my PowerPoint is not wanting to share, so I'm not going to share my screen. I'm just going to speak. So I'm going to briefly touch on the challenges with measuring corruption within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So with trillions of dollars being siphoned off to corruption each year, reducing corruption is one of the most important ways to create sustainable development and achieve the goals of the 2030 Agenda. The impacts of corruption are cross-cutting and hinder progress towards all of the goals. As Slavomir mentioned, in particularly, they impact SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. There is an established cycle where corruption weakens the rule of law and a weak rule of law enables corruption. In order to break this seemingly intractable cycle, we must develop effective strategies for understanding and measuring corruption. This is of particular importance now as corruption and criminality continue to evolve within the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Corruption is inclusive of several types of behaviors, affects a variety of actors, and is by nature a collusive and consensual social act. Because of this complexity, both defining and measuring corruption are challenging tasks. The participatory nature of corruption has led to extremely high dark figures of this crime. As we are collectively learning through the voluntary national review process, ensuring data quality is challenging as we attempt to reduce complex human behaviors to measurable indicators. To date, the majority of scholarly work focusing on measuring corruption has prioritized analyzing and critiquing the methods of international corruption surveys. Very little attention has been paid to evaluating the relevance and quality of existing national corruption surveys towards measuring progress towards Target 16.5, which seeks to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all of their forms. Analysis of the information available shows us that the main challenges are as follows. Data validity is the first one. Measurement processes only measure one aspect of corruption, such as bribery. While passive bribery might be something that is easy to identify and measure, it focuses on low-level corruption and does not provide any insight into highly organized or systemic corruption. There are also still no clear guidelines on how to measure the range of other forms of corruption defined and criminalized by the UN Convention Against Corruption. Another challenge that we see is comparability. The definitions that are used can be culturally biased and are not transferable. For example, using the term bribery has negative connotations and may encourage a survey taker not to report. Bribery also more commonly occurs in developing nations, where developed nations are more likely to experience grand corruption. A measurement process focused on bribery would fail to capture this. Another issue is regularity. The majority of existing national surveys in the literature were conducted only once. This can provide important point-in-time information, but provides little insight into the impact of reform or policy changes. Finally, a challenge that we're seeing is raw data accessibility. In addition to methodological challenges, including cost, time, and accessibility of collecting data, available literature tells us that many national governments rely on corruption data collected by international organizations. While this can be extremely valuable, care must be given to ensure that data is used for relevant policy reform rather than focusing on the political value of corruption measurement and demonstrating compliance with international norms for gain. There are some suggestions for the future. In 2018, the UNODC, UNDP, and UNODC INEGI developed a manual on corruption surveys, which supports national statistical offices develop specific measurement tools for corruption. The manual only addresses one method for measuring corruption, which are sample surveys. Sample surveys are widely recognized as the most reliable and methodologically sound process for collecting corruption data. While sample surveys provide the opportunity to collect high-quality data, the challenge remains that the number of UN member states developing sample surveys on corruption is still very limited. This is generally due to the cost of implementation. Future work could focus on measuring the cost-benefit analysis of this investment. Another recommendation is increased standard methodological guidance for sample surveys. As additional corruption measures are developed, dedicated guidelines on how to implement them would be necessary. The guidelines which discuss which types of corruption using activities defined by the UN Convention Against Corruption would be best measured by which specific indicator, which data sources should be used to measure the indicator, and any methodological challenges that would need to be considered. Thank you.
Much for this presentation, interesting thoughts about the future of measuring corruption. And now it is my great pleasure to give a floor to Gillian Dell, the head of conventions at the Transparency International, for her insight and practically conclusion of this panel. Gillian, the floor is yours. All the floor.
Thank you very much, Ugi. Greetings from the Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin. And thanks very much to the Global Initiative for organizing this panel. It's on a very important subject. Also, thanks to my fellow panelists for their very interesting remarks. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And in terms of international governance, that is the subject of this panel, like GI-TOC, we believe it is crucial to break down UN silos in order to improve how transnational corruption and organized crime are tackled at both international and national levels. And we have a special interest in breaking them down in order to tackle grand corruption. The silos we're particularly concerned with concern UNCAC and UNTOC discussions in Vienna, and also those separating those treaty bodies and the UN centers working on human rights and the SDGs. Regarding the corruption and organized crime nexus, we referred to several dimensions in the joint submission mentioned by Ian that we made with the Global Initiative to the last UNCAC COSP. For example, corruption is often used by traditional structured organized crime groups to enable illicit activities like trafficking in humans, drugs, and weapons, sometimes also using violence and intimidation as part of their modus operandi. In the worst cases, this involves not just low or mid-level officials, but also high-level decision makers, and it may also include infiltration or capture of state institutions. We can see here the need to take into account both UNCAC and UNTOC. And then there are grand corruption schemes, which involve a somewhat different nexus between corruption and organized crime. We're referring here to an organized and transnational crime involving high-level officials and, quote, vast quantities of assets that causes widespread human rights violations and blocks achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are large, sophisticated conspiracies where corruption itself is the main criminal activity, a collective enterprise carried out across borders by networks inside and outside the state. This can rightly be called transnational organized corruption, which Ugi and Ian have referred to. The UN Common Position to Address Global Corruption describes these networks, mentioning public officials, companies, financial institutions, professional enablers, and traditional organized crime. Part of the scheme, the grand corruption scheme, is generally subversion of oversight and justice institutions. As a side note, at TI, we have developed a legal definition of grand corruption that could provide a basis for special national and international measures. The nexus between organized crime and corruption tells us that efforts against the two should be coordinated. As Ghada Bali, Executive Director of UNODC, has said, you cannot address one without tackling the other. So the two conventions, UNCAC and UNTOC, are most certainly both relevant for grand corruption. More generally, there are common challenges, and the two conventions have overlaps and complementary components. So coordinating the work on them would increase efficiency and effectiveness in international and national efforts against both. At international level, that means coordinating the work of their conferences of states parties, their working groups, and their review mechanisms. And this is why we join with GI-TOC and others in calling for the UN Crime Commission to help initiate regular joint meetings of those bodies. We also believe that the Crime Commission should promote greater coordination between anti-corruption work in Vienna and the work of UN human rights bodies in Geneva. The Human Rights Council has highlighted the importance of human rights standards for anti-corruption efforts in its latest resolution on the impact of corruption on human rights. The resolution says that essential anti-corruption elements include democracy and promotion and protection of human rights. It specifically names access to information and the right to take part in public affairs, among others. This, of course, is a broader agenda than the UNCAC has, and it is important to consider and discuss what this implies for anti-corruption discussions in Vienna. UN human rights bodies increasingly also make findings and observations about corruption in member states and its adverse human rights impacts. The Center for Civil and Political Rights in Geneva has made a very interesting assessment of this trend. We welcome that UNODC is organizing a side event tomorrow on the impact of corruption on human rights. Beyond that, in view of the importance of the work on corruption of human rights bodies in Geneva, we urge the UN Crime Commission to facilitate more regular exchanges between human rights and anti-corruption bodies, including under a regular agenda item at Crime Commission sessions. And we also encourage the Crime Commission to help ensure respect for international human rights standards in all the work of intergovernmental bodies meeting in Vienna. And while we're talking about a role for the Crime Commission in fostering discussion, we also believe that they should include the UNGAS Against Corruption Political Declaration as an agenda item in Crime Commission sessions, considering that it expands on the anti-corruption framework and that the follow-up thus far planned is relatively weak. Last and most important, we believe the Crime Commission can play a vital role in initiating collective work on grand corruption impunity, the elephant in the room. Developing new approaches calls for interdisciplinary expertise, including on corruption, organized crime, and human rights. So we are calling for the Commission to establish an intergovernmental expert working group on grand corruption to develop concrete proposals to plug the gaps in international frameworks that allow grand corruption to thrive. Many thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you again. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Gillian. We are right on time. So I have to apologize for the participants that are not able to pose any questions, but we are open to answering your questions or comments through email. You may send it to the Secretariat of Global Initiative, and we will then disperse it to the participants of this panel. Once again, thank you very much to all the panelists. I personally appreciated all your contribution, and I am sure that our cooperation as a strategic issue for bettering governance of international phenomena will bring some fruits in the future. Thank you very much and keep well.